Thank you very much for your speech. I really appreciate it, and I'm deeply touched by what you're bringing to light. And as a member of a mostly white community that's lived there for almost 16 years, I'd like to know what I, on an inner level, can do to break these things apart. I see what you're talking about in society and structures, but what do I do to bat at things that I can barely see myself?
Right. Well, you know, you can't take on things that you don't see. So first is you have to really sort of train yourself to see things, because the truth is the culture trains you not to. I mean, the culture trains us not to see injustice. The culture trains us not to see oppression. The culture trains us not even to think of systems at all. You know, and it does this a lot of ways. The media does this, the schools do this, the patriotic sort of flag-waving, rah-rah stuff that we do, and all nations do it. We're not the only one. We don't even do it necessarily more than others. I would imagine that others do it just as much. But that always makes it hard for people, embedded in a social structure that is so self-congratulatory. And in some ways, we are worse about that than other places. Makes it very hard for us to see injustice, because to see injustice is to acknowledge that we're not who we think we are as a society, and that's painful for some people to recognize, especially when they've had the luxury of believing that we were that place. People of color have sort of known, you know? So part of it is constantly informing yourself, constantly listening to what people of color are saying, and so often being ignored for saying. You know, part of attacking white privilege is coming to recognize, each and every one of us in this room, that if you sat here and you took this from me tonight, and I said some stuff which you know full well any person of color stands up here and says, I don't care how liberal you think you are. I don't care how progressive and radical you think you are. It's going to feel different in your body to hear this from a person of color. And yet people of color say this stuff all the time. Now, if it goes down a little bit easier coming from me, think about A, why is that, right? And B, what do you intend to do with that? Like, if you're somebody who is in the dominant group, that gives you a little insight into the power that you potentially have and how you have to be careful with that power. And you have to acknowledge that that is, in fact, unearned and unjust power. But you also have to figure out how to use it. And in your daily life, that might mean talking about it. You said you live in a mostly white community. You're going to have plenty of opportunities, unfortunately, to challenge other folks in that mostly white community, whether it's with regard to things they say or things they do, the way that organizations are structured in that community, the way that schools are structured in that community, the way that curricula in those schools are structured, the way that law enforcement takes place, the way that job opportunities do or don't take place. There are going to be opportunities, but before you can do a good job of challenging and calling those things out, it is important to constantly, I mean, I get up every day and I go out about my business, and it's not like every minute I'm like looking for racism, because that'll make you crazy. And you don't have to look all the time. It'll find you. You'll see it. But I do. There are times when I go out and I'm making sure that I'm especially alert, you know? Like if I go to a shopping mall where I know what people of color experience in that space. I know the way that they're getting followed around because I've heard the stories. So I decide I'm going to go to that mall today. I got to buy some pants, or I got to buy some shoes. I got to get whatever I got to get. But I'm not just going to go buy my product, right? I'm going to go and really, like as a sociologist, I'm going to observe what is going on. And when I see something, if I do, and I might not, you know, you go out someday, you don't see it. Great, wonderful, celebrate, you know. But there are other times when you will, and then it's incumbent upon you to say and prepare beforehand, what are you going to do? How are you going to respond? How are you going to challenge the clerk that followed that young person of color around, made them put their bag at the front of the store and didn't do the same thing for a young white kid? What are you going to do when somebody's given worse customer service? Are you prepared to challenge it? And maybe not just alone challenge it, but go back with friends and do it. Like have it be a collective effort, because you doing it alone, that clerk might be able to say, well, you're just crazy. You know, you're just hypersensitive, just like all those brown folk are, you know. But if you go back in teams of white folks, and every time that team sees stuff, they go up and they bust it, and they bust it, and they bust it. And I saw what you did, and they bust it. Yeah, they might get angry, but you know what they also get? They get embarrassed as hell. And after a while, those clerks start to think, well, man, I don't know if I can get away with this anymore. Like every time I follow, I just doing what they told me to do. Every time I follow that black kid around, man, some crazy white woman in ladies' lingerie jumps up and says, aha, I see you. Right, and so then after a while, those white folks start to wonder when they get busted out by white men, by white women, and it's like at some point they go, it's just not worth it. And then the behavior can change, and I'm making light of it, but I'm telling you, that thing I just mentioned, I've done that. And I know people who have done that, and it has created some space in those shopping centers where people are being profiled all the time, and folks have just like thrown up their hands. That's just one small example, but it's an example of how if you're on the alert, you know, because people of color are on the alert. They have to be. You can't walk out of the house. I mean, you could try and not be ready, but, you know, we know what happens in those situations. You let down your guard, and then, you know, you think that when the officer says, get your hands up, that you're supposed to show him your ID first and pull that out. And you're Amadou Diallo, 41 shots later, lying dead in the vestibule of your own apartment. So at some point, we have to spend as much time as we can informing ourselves. Part of that is reading, sure, but also it's listening. And it's also just being on alert when we go out about our business, looking for the things that otherwise we might overlook. Thank you for your question. I appreciate it. Yeah.